It's good to see everybody this evening. We're going to be continuing our study through the Old Testament. To get everyone up to date, we have new people here with us, and we're glad you're here. And we have visitors as well to sort of just get everybody up to speed. We've been doing a study on Sunday evenings, a lot of Wednesday nights, going through the Old Testament. And really the biggest reason I think we get, I'm not saying we get lost right now, but one of the things that we need to focus on while we're doing this is to really develop a better understanding of the New Testament. When you read through the New Testament, you can understand who Jesus is and how you need to be saved and understand all these things, but you're missing so much of the real details and the real meat of the Word if you don't understand what came before it. In the Old Testament, we learn what sin is. We learn what makes God's wrath, against us. We learn all of these things about God's character and His expectations and how He interacts with people in the world. And without that, when you go into the New Testament, it's like picking up in a movie, right before the climax, but it doesn't give you the same understanding and appreciation for how you got to that point. And so just to keep that in mind, this is a big reason why we're going through the Old Testament, is to help us understand more clearly what we are to be in the New Testament, understand who Christ was, why He was, how He fulfilled everything, proving who He was, and so forth. So anyway, so where we're at now, we just finished the period of the Judges, and we're beginning a new section of time here that we typically refer to as the United Kingdom. It has nothing to do with Great Britain. It has everything to do with the nation of Israel. And basically this evening we're just going to be doing an overview of that time period. I'm not going to get very deep in anything. Honestly, if you include everything, the wisdom literature and all, there's 227 chapters that could be in this time period. So we're going to be very broad this evening. But to give a little bit of background, I would like to turn to Deuteronomy 17, and let's start there at verse 14 through 20. This is some principles that God lays out about the principles governing kings, as He knew that the nation would want to establish a kingship sometime after coming into the land of Canaan. And He lays out these rules many, many hundreds of years prior to this ever happening. But Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting at verse 14, it says, "When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel." So before coming to Canaan, as I already said, God realized, He knows that they're going to want to establish an earthly kingship to be just like the other nations. He knows they want a king, and He provides these guidelines as to what that king. These are just, some small guidelines here. There are others, but just as a few points here. Things that they are to do and things that are not to do. And we'll see really all of these rules. Some of these rules sound very vague and very strange. Multiplying horses, amounting a bunch of gold and silver, returning to Egypt. There's a lot of very fine details there. But you'll see as you read through this section that every one of those details are pertinent, and every one of them they fell in, and they break each one of these commandments during this time period. So a little more introduction. We're not yet into the United Kingdom here, but we need to introduce a very important person that is a big player in this time period, and that's Samuel. Samuel was he was a prophet. He was a judge. He was from the tribe of Ephraim. He was born to Elkanah and Hannah. And Hannah was a woman who was barren, and she desired so greatly to have a son that she made a pledge to God that if she would bless him with a son, then he would be dedicated to his service for all his life. And he was just done that way. We can see that 1 Samuel verses 1, 20 through 22. 1 Samuel 1, 20 through 22. This is just a little excerpt. So it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked for him from the Lord. Now the man Elkanah and his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow, but Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, not until the child is weaned, then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. And she did exactly that. She didn't go up at that point. She wanted to give the child time to mature, and she turned him over for good to the priest there. And Samuel spent his time growing up serving under Eli the priest in the tabernacle. Then he became a very mighty prophet and ultimately a judge over Israel. And it's going to be Samuel that anoints the first two kings in Israel before his death. So now we understand who Samuel is. Let's now look at really the request, the turning point from the Judges period into the United Kingdom period. And we can see that beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 8. This is a pretty short chapter. We're just going to read the whole thing. It'll tell the story better than I can paraphrase it. So if you'll bear with me, we'll read through this. And hopefully I won't trip over too many words. 1 Samuel chapter 8 says, Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and his name of his second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people and in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So Samuel told all the words to the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. Now Samuel's now talking to the children of Israel. And he said, This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over 50s, will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in the day because of your king, who you have chosen for yourselves. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, Heed their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, Every man go to his city. So here we see the original plea for a king. And just to summarize that quickly, so we saw first that Samuel's sons were appointed judges after him to judge the nation, and they were performing pretty wickedly. They were taking bribes. They were perverting justice. They were doing a lot of bad things, and the nation was rightfully upset with that. And they approached Samuel, and all of Israel's gathered together here, and they request for a king to lead them, it says, as other nations around them function. They wanted to be similar. They wanted to have a similar setup as the nations around them. And this really, it displeased Samuel. I don't believe it was because his sons were corrupt and he was proud of his sons and he wanted them to keep being their judges. I don't think that's why it displeased him at all. But I believe it displeased him because God was their special leader. He was their king. Their nation was led and governed by God and not by man. And I think this is why Samuel was displeased about this. But as God said in verse 7, they were not rejecting Samuel. Instead, they were rejecting God as their king who would reign over them. And in his place, they wanted to put a man. And Samuel continues to persuade them by warning of all the repercussions of the king, but the people wouldn't have it. He listed a lot of stuff in there that we can all relate to. A tenth of this and a tenth of that and all of this, taxes and all of these things. Your sons are going to be his servants now and not your own servants. They're going to be taken for war and all these things that I think we can all relate to living in a similar government, you might say, as far as taxation and burden of living in any government, honestly. But nonetheless, all of these things that aren't inherently just, I'm happy to have this government. But nonetheless, that's what they wanted. Not understanding all of the ramifications, but they did insist on it. And there it says there in verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And that was their reasoning here, that they would be like the other nations. That's one of the things they mentioned. That their king would judge them. That was another one. And the other would be that their king would be a leader in battle before them. So he would be a military leader as well. And this literally displaced all the things that God was doing for them. He was their judge. He was his words were their judge. He was their leader in battle. He went out before them in every battle. It wasn't Israel's strength that won all their battles and got them to the position that they were in. It was God's forces, not their own. And so what they're literally doing is putting a man between them and God, just creating more separation between God and man. They don't want to deal as directly with God as they currently are, and they want to put a king in that position that's a man instead of God Almighty. So that's kind of an introduction there to what they requested and what they're going to get. And just a couple notes real quick. Books covered during this time period. We have, of course, what we're reading now, 1 Samuel. This is a transition from the Judges period to the United Kingdom period, and it concludes with the death of the first king being Saul. Then we have 2 Samuel. It begins at Saul's death and picks up there and covers David's reign as king. There are 3 kings. I should get this out of the way. There's going to be Saul, his first king. Then there's David. And then there's Solomon. And that is all 3 kings in the United Kingdom period. And then we have the book of 1 Kings. This begins with the end of David and the appointment of Solomon as king. And during this book, the kingdom divides. So all that time has already passed there sometime in the book of 1 Kings. And the kingdom divides during the reign of Solomon's son, Rehoboam. And Judah is, the northern tribes and the southern tribes are segregated there. And then we also have retelling a lot of the historical accounts in 1st and 2nd Chronicles that cover the same time period there. And all of that in 1st and 2nd Chronicles concludes in 2nd Chronicles chapter 9. So that's just some information more so for you here. But ultimately, these writings, these historical sections of this time period accounts for 104 chapters in the Old Testament. In addition to these books, there's also much of the wisdom literature that we refer to as wisdom literature, being the Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. A lot of these wisdom-based books were also written in this same time period. And much of the Psalms were written or attributed to David. Based off what I could find, about 73 of the 150 chapters in Psalms are attributed to David's writing. So he's a 49% stakeholder in the book of Psalms. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon were nearly exclusively written by Solomon. And combining all these books from this time period, having 104 historical, we'll call them books of chapters of history. There's 104, and chapters of the wisdom literature being 123. That adds up to 227 chapters out of the 989 in the Old Testament, which comes up to right at 25% of the Old Testament, based by chapter, not by word count or anything else, page number, just chapters. But roughly 25% of the chapters in the Old Testament are in this small time period, which only accounts for about 130 years. You read Genesis, it's 50 chapters, and it's a lot more time. But there's a ton of material in this section of Scripture. And a lot of it is very important for our learning. So that's all I have there. Now we're basically going to do a very big overview, a very broad overview of these three kings, looking at their appointment, some of the more known highlights of each of their lives, some of the accomplishments, some of the failures, and just get a better, prepare our minds for the next bit of teaching that we're going to be covering through this segment. So the first one, of course, is King Saul. Just shortly, the following chapters after they had requested a king from Samuel, and he speaks with them and gives them these warnings, they go right into it. 1 Samuel chapter 10, let's pick up there. We'll read verses 17 through 19. 1 Samuel 10, starting verse 17. It says, Then Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and said to the children of Israel, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians, and from the hands of all the kingdoms, and from those who oppressed you. But you have today rejected your God. Look at the emphasis, verse 19, let's read that carefully. But you have today rejected your God, who himself saved you from all of your adversities and all your tribulations, and have said to him, No, set a king over us. And that's back to that point. They're just making another layer of separation between them and God. Now, therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. And from all the people there gathered together, Saul was brought out before them and anointed as king. And the people were really thrilled about it, because Saul was a very good-looking guy. He was very tall, very impressive physically, but and he started out well, but he soon had a pretty early demise in his rule. And that's where we'll pick back up. And it didn't take long for Saul to make some really poor choices that greatly affected his relationship with God and the people. 1 Samuel 13, so we were there at 1 Samuel 10, 3 chapters later. We see, we're not going to read anything there, but just a couple highlights. 1 Samuel 13, Saul offers an unlawful sacrifice before God and failed to follow the direction from Samuel. Became impatient with waiting on Samuel to arrive to this point, and he lost his patience and took matters to his own hands and did some things that he was clearly not supposed to. And then the following chapter, 1 Samuel 14, Saul makes this foolish oath, really, and if he hadn't been stopped by the people, he was going to kill his own son to prove that point and stick to that oath that he never should have made. And then also 1 Samuel 15, the following chapter, and this is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. Saul was given very detailed and specific instructions to take the army of Israel and basically utterly annihilate all of the Amalekites. They were supposed to go in and kill every single person. Don't save the king, don't save the children, kill them all. And he didn't do that. They're also supposed to kill all the livestock even. It was just wipe the map of them. And he failed to do that. He did save the king as a trophy piece. And he also allowed the Israelite army to keep the choicest of the livestock, the cattle, whatever they deemed good, they basically just kept. So they did not follow the word of the Lord. And as I said, it was basically from that point forward, it was the demise of his kingdom. And we can see that here in 1 Samuel 15, verses 22 through 23. This is Samuel rebuking Saul here. There it says, So Samuel said, Has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have just rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king. Now he will remain the king for some time, but his successor is being anointed just right after. So just after this occurrence, Samuel is commissioned by God to go to Jesse, the father of David, and choose from his sons the next king. And no time was wasted there. And at that moment, Samuel anointed David as king. Now, he didn't become the reigning king until years later. But from that point forward, Saul really has quite a bit of a downhill stroke. You know, we're not going to go into all the stories about David, but as David became a great warrior, you know, his starting point there where we really come to know about David and his character and his ability, of course, is David and Goliath. He kills the giant of the Philistines and basically wins that battle with the Philistines. And from that point forward, David's in the army. He becomes a very great military leader from a young age. He's doing very impressive things. And Saul did not like that really much at all, because he was the military leader. He was the king. And really everybody was cheering David on. They were greater fans of David than they were of Saul. And he resented David to the point that he basically the rest of his life is spent trying to capture and kill David, because he is such a threat to his kingdom. And he basically reaches a point of insanity there. And at the end of 1 Samuel, we see Saul hot in battle against the Philistines. And just as prophesied shortly before this, Saul and all three of his sons were killed in battle against the Philistines. And that ends the book there of 1 Samuel. A lot transpired in that time. The remainder of 1 Samuel it's as Aaron said previously, the book of 1 and 2 Samuel is very action-packed, very easy to read, very interesting as you read through it. There's a lot of things going on, and basically a very significant portion of that is the basically the chase between David and Saul, and it's very, very interesting read. Especially when you see all the kindness and all the opportunities that David makes to not ever go on the offensive against the king. He would not do it. He would simply, flee the situation. And he had every bit and ability to kill Saul multiple times, and he spared him out of his kindness and his faithfulness to God. And it ultimately played to his success. That was the character that David had. So now we'll just overview David very similarly. Following Saul's death, David was made king at first, originally over just Judah, and then the entirety of Israel. Just a few chapters later, in 2 Samuel chapter 5, and basically there was some internal kind of disagreements as to who was going to be the next king after Saul died. But it didn't take very long that David was over all of Israel. And he was described as a man after God's own heart. David, as I already said, David's character was very faithful to the Lord. He was very committed, very honorable man. And he had a lot of military excellence, and that's a lot of what David was known for. And much of his reign was spent in battle. During his reign, Israel defeated their enemies pretty much: the Philistines, the Moabites, Zobah, Syrians, the Edomites, and the Ammonites. All of these thorns in their side were put to the side during his reign. He basically successfully conquered all of these people during his reign. And many were subdued and made servants of Israel, and the borders of Israel were expanded to the river Euphrates. It wasn't fully expanded, but they made very significant progress while David was king. And this wasn't the only ability of David's. He was a man of war, but he was also a man of God. He was very, very loyal to God, and he had a very strong talent in his writing. David wrote many psalms, and songs of praise and thanksgiving and cries for help and begging for forgiveness. As I said, I think it was 73 of the 150 psalms were accredited to his authorship. So he spent much time in the law, and much time in prayer to God, and much time in spiritual things. He wasn't just a military leader; he was a man of God. And we see that also in God establishing a very important covenant with David. We'll call it the Davidic Covenant. We'll read a little bit about it here. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Second Samuel chapter 7, we'll start at verse 12. It says, "When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers," this is God talking to David, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So God makes a covenant here to David to maintain his seed as the kingship over Israel forever, it says. And this is significant for many reasons, but really its fulfillment comes in Christ. We see Jesus being a descendant from the lineage of David, the tribe of Judah. He meets all the ancestral criteria that was understood in the coming Messiah, and he is established, and his reign does continue forever here. That's the fulfillment of that. There are, of course, a lot more details and a lot more information about the Davidic kingdom, but that's its fulfillment. And you will see throughout the remainder of the Old Testament in Judah, his kingdom will remain as long as there's kings in Judah. So this is a very true statement. You can see it fulfilled in history. But just like everybody, David had struggles too, and a lot of the end of his kingship was plagued with that. He would suffer much consequences for the sins that he committed. After the affair with Bathsheba, we're all very familiar with that story. He had an affair with Bathsheba, attempted to cover it up, and ultimately had one of his military leaders killed in battle, basically a staged murder to cover up his guilt and his sin. And because of that, he's going to suffer very great consequences. We can see that in 2 Samuel 12, 9 through 15. We won't read that. But from that time forward, David would suffer a lot from his family against him. And basically the remainder of his rule, he would be in a constant state of struggle from without and from within. And he would really not have much rest the remainder of his life dealing with the consequences of his actions. Now, his sin was forgiven. He was still a man after God's own heart. He was forgiven, but he suffered greatly because of his choices. And that's one thing to draw out. Now, we've probably drawn it out 10 times already through the Old Testament study, is that you can sin and you can be forgiven, but just remember that your consequences are not going to be wiped clean from your sin. You can stand in a right relationship with God after you've repented and you've made things right, but the trouble in this life that comes with it is not going to go away. And you can see that very, very clearly in David's life. He took it to his grave. And that's basically all I have about David today. Now we're going to finish with King Solomon. This is David's son from Bathsheba, who became his wife. And we'll pick up with the 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. This is some instruction that David gives to Solomon shortly before his death. It's a longer section than what we're reading here, but this is, I think, the most pertinent to the kingship. Starting at 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Now the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, If your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in the truth with all of their heart and with all of their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel." And Solomon took this advice. I think he started out very, very well. He really capitalized on David's military victories, and he reigned very successfully for many years. This was ultimately the peak of the united kingship of Israel. All the kingships of Israel, it was the ultimate fulfillment of it was in Solomon. And Aaron had a very good lesson about this just a few weeks ago, about the reign of David and Solomon. They're very interrelated. Really, David was he did a lot of the legwork, and Solomon did a lot of the benefiting from that work. And anyway, this is ultimately the peak of the Israelite kingdom. And we see something very important about Solomon here. Let's go to, or we won't read anything there, but from 1 Kings chapter 3, this is a very important thing about Solomon. God comes to him in a dream, and he basically asks Solomon, what do you want? What can I give you? And to show Solomon's character, he was young at this point, and he told God, he said, I'm a young man. I don't know how to discern right from wrong. I don't know how to do a lot of these things. I'm going to have to do it as king. Please give me wisdom. Please give me righteous judgment and ruling over your people to discern evil from good. And God was so very, pleased with his request. He didn't ask for anything great riches, great stature. He didn't ask for anything worldly. He asked for guidance and wisdom in leading God's people. And God blessed him greatly with wisdom. He had immense understanding and knowledge, greater than any man that's ever lived besides him during his day. And I would say Elon Musk is not as smart as Solomon. It may be no technology, but the wisdom that Solomon had was from God, and he had great understanding in basically any field. And during his reign, there was very great wealth and great peace. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 20, I think, paints a picture. It's just a short verse, but gives a good general sense of the state of the nation or the state of the union during his reign. There it says, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. The borders of Israel were expanded to its fullest limits. There was minimal war with other nations. They were on top of the other nations. They were servants to them at this point. Their enemies were beat down. The nation's financials were at an all-time high. They said, I think during Solomon's reign, silver was accounted as like gravel, basically. It was here, there, and everywhere. People stepped over it in the streets. So it was a very good time financially, economically. Greater, as I said, than it's the peak of the Israelite kingdom. The kingdom was large and thriving, and it's like one of those things that they probably went to bed and didn't have to lock their doors. Their kids could ride their bicycles, 10 miles from home, and the parents not have to worry about them. Just like we all did when we were kids. We all say that. I was born in the 90s, and I say that. People who were born in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s say that, and I'm sure it's all gotten worse and worse and worse, and it definitely is worse now. But, I remember when we lived in Lawrenceburg there until I was about 10 years old. till I was about 10. And for years while I lived there, less than 10 years old, we'd ride our bikes all day long. Mom wouldn't find, you see us all day. We'd be gone doing whatever, and nobody ever bothered us. Never had, I think there was only maybe once or twice that there was actually a panic where someone was looking for me. But beyond that, we'd ride our bikes to the gas stations up at, where the golf course is in Lawrenceburg. We'd go all the way out there, try to find $1 worth of money to buy something and go back home. And it's kind of like that, everything was good. There wasn't a lot of crime in the streets. Everybody was on a high, and they clearly were. And we also see a very big milestone in Solomon's reign in establishing and building the temple. Previously God's presence had dwelt in the tabernacle, in this tent they would move, set up, very elaborate, but nonetheless it was a tent that they had to destruct and construct wherever they go. And that's where the presence of God dwelt among Israel. And upon this milestone, they built the temple, a very great and fascinating, very impressive structure in which God's presence would dwell. And David had made the plans and gathered the materials and basically wanted to build the temple, but God was not going to allow him because he was a man of great war and a lot of bloodshed, and he didn't want that. David to build the temple, but he did say that his son would do it, and we see Solomon fulfilling that in 1 Kings chapter 6 through chapter 8. But ultimately, all these kings had their problems. We can read of Solomon's demise in 1 Kings chapter 11. Everything was not perfect, in his entire reign. While many great accomplishments were made, peace and prosperity were had, Solomon's faithfulness to God degraded over time. We can see that in 1 Kings 11, 1 through 4. Keep in mind those statutes that we read at the very beginning. We see a few of these broken, and you can see a few more broken throughout his reign, but specifically dealing with having multiple wives and marrying from wives of other nations. 1 Kings 11, starting at verse 1. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughters of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Every one of these are their enemies. They go to war with every one of these nations frequently, and he's marrying their wives. He's marrying their women. He's making treaties with them. Even Egypt, he marries a princess from Egypt in basically a treaty. From the nations of whom the Lord has said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Let's skip on down to verse 11. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Here we see God's judgment on Solomon's idolatry. He says the kingdom's going to be split. Makes you wonder how long this kingdom could have continued had Solomon not went into an idolatrous lifestyle, if he hadn't started worshiping other gods, marrying all these foreign women. This is the punishment for it, was the splitting of the kingdom. It's not like it had to end now. It could have went on for years and years and years, but because of his choices, we see that God is going to tear the kingdom in half. And David's lineage will continue to reign, as he said. He made that promise forever. And they will continue to reign, but it's only going to be over the tribe of Judah as opposed to the entire nation of Israel. And this is, as I already said, the split's going to occur with his son Rehoboam. And basically, from start to end there, we have a very brief overview of this United Kingdom period. There's some very great highs, and there's some lows as well. And as I said, I hope we can take away a good understanding of just the high points. I know that's all of these are very high points. You can't go into enough detail on 227 chapters in 30 minutes. But I hope we have a good understanding of the main things that are going on in this period as we continue to study deeper in more specific details and occurrences through this study. I don't have anything else. I would open it up if there's a brother that has anything interesting they'd like to input in relation to this. I'll give you that opportunity at this time. All right, I don't see anyone, so nothing else. We wouldn't want to close the service without extending the invitation to you. If you've never obeyed the gospel plan of salvation, you are lost in sin, and you're not in the right state with God. First, you have to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. You have to acknowledge your sin and repent of it. Confess Jesus as the Son of God, and be baptized in a watery grave of baptism for the remission of your sins. And then you're a new creation. You're in the right state with the God that we've just been reading about, who is very just, and He is going to deal with sin in your life. You can be in a good state with Him. You could be back to a right state with Him if you haven't done that before, or if you have. And if you have sin on your account, specifically anything public that needs to be made right before us, or a private sin that you simply would request the prayers of the church for, we can take care of either one at this time while we stand and sing.